Now, as I say, in the flying squad in Pretoria is where I spent most of my career. And I will remember you walk into a place and you see the bullet holes. I will explain to you the difference, how things went from bad to worse through political nonsense. Is that when I arrived at the flying squad, I had a P-38 pistol, which is not bad but not good either, with 16 rounds, two magazines of 8 rounds each. When I left there 3, 4 years later, we each had a Z88, which is basically a Beretta with two 15 rounds magazine. Most of us had an extra 20 round magazine, and we all had extra firearms. You could have a R4, R5, Uzi, R1, actually the R2 with a folding butt. That thing is fantastic to shoot a stolen car with a heavier caliber, while the R5 and R4, of course, is so much better for house penetration. The Uzi I never really liked. I thought it was overrated. Never carried one, never liked it. But for certain use, of course, it's really good. And if you listen to the Railway Police Special Task Force talking about it, they rate it very highly. I know you guys in the army voted that the Uzi was the worst weapon you ever had to work with. But apparently it came out that you had the wrong ammunition. There was something wrong with the ammunition which you had and which the police had. Now that's another thing in the police, because we were not bound by the Geneva Conventions. We could actually use dum-dum rounds and expanding bullets, things like that. So we quickly got into reloading, and we really knew a lot about what bullets can do to people. Our knowledge on that were astonishing, because we've seen it and done it, and we would observe. That's the one thing in the police, you observe everything. Even to this day, if I walk into a room, I see everything. I can walk out and describe to you exactly who sat where, who's wearing what, who's acting strange, who I find suspicious, who's out of order or out of place. You have this thing which is getting to you. I suppose it's a sixth sense. The policeman here listening to me now will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just one glance, and we know. So we know where there's danger, where's something wrong, whatever. We know these things. So anyway, you first start in the flying squad by answering the 10111 telephones. Since I could speak a bit of English, I would always answer when somebody started speaking the English on the outside. The way our system works is all the reports would go to this 10111 number, and then the radio network would broadcast the message, and they would send the different vehicles to different crime scenes. So you can imagine this is one hell of a job. One hell of a job. If those two radio people, they would sit there and they would just bark out these messages, and they would get the feedback, make the notes, and then it goes to the duty sergeant, which I became about a year or so later. And you would put it all in a big manual, like a file. It's like this big. Sometimes it's called, I think, a Form 280. So what happens is you call 10111, and yeah, I know you guys are going to tell me it doesn't work anymore. But it worked in those days. And so you would call, and we would get your details, and then we would fill it in, and we give it to the radio guys, and they would go on the network. I ask for a vehicle close by, go in a tent, the guys would go there. Now this is crucial. Once you get to the scene, the crime scene, you have to sign off. In other words, you have to say to Romeo, which is the controlling body, you have to say you're at the crime scene and you're moving out. Because otherwise, other policemen might arrive and they don't know you're on the scene. Especially if you're a detective, we're not wearing uniform, and now you walk around there with a rifle or a firearm, and then, yeah, there's a good chance of we killing you. Because we're on the edge, we're going in looking for terrorists or looking for armed robbers or whatever. Many times the same thing, by the way. So it's very important. The radio procedure is extremely important. So anyway, we had a lot of fun there. Everything which happened in Pretoria, from the Sterland bomb to the Witwolf shooting incident there straight on plane, that Haroff, or what's it, Van Rooyen, pedophiles, and all of those things happened while I was there. So we were involved. And of course, the unit would be there first. So even if you were on the border or you were not right there at that time, doesn't matter. It's your friends who are involved. You have inside knowledge of what happened there. And then a lot of things which happened is not what you read on the newspapers or wherever. Uh, they were very funny incidents. I remember chasing people. They were driving vehicles recklessly. That's a different thing. If you're chasing somebody, you still have to slow down up to a point for a red traffic light. Your criminals don't do that. So one day we had an interesting thing because I had a dream the night before. And in the dream, I saw three of our guys actually lying in coffins, and there was another one in a coffin with his sister. I didn't even know he had a sister. She was crying there, but I had the feeling to walk to her. This is in the dream now. And I said to her, look, he's not dead. He's not dead. And she was like, no, he's going to die. And I said, no, he's not dead. And he got out of a coffin, he wasn't. So would you believe the next day there was a dreadful incident and three guys were dead. One was thrown right out of a vehicle. He didn't die. But I think he later murdered his wife and children and he ended up in jail. And then he died as well. It's a sad story, lots of sad stories. And we had to, of course, attend the funerals. Oh, man. Yeah. I felt sorry for the colonel and the officers, the senior officers who have to attend these things. Because they would arrive there and they looked splendid, they had their full dress uniform, all their medals, decorations, gloves, those little brown gloves. And they would have to talk to the parents and wife, and the sister and things like that. I had to speak to the family, which was deeply emotional, as you can imagine. And the parents would always be dressed very, very sharply, like in their church clothes, and they would really try to be put a good face on things, but they just lost a child, or a husband, or a wife. It's dreadful, man. There's a lot of emotion, and we would do the honor parades, so we would also arrive and we would be standing there doing the best to drill. But by this time, we're out of the police college for a few years. So we're not as sharp as the police college students would be, not at all. And I recall in one of the funerals, actually, the police orchestra was also there, or part of it. And they were all of these things. And for them, of course, they just there, but they had no emotions about it. And so they were there, and one of them made a comment about how sloppy our drill is and blah, blah, blah. And so one guy just moved me. Because at that time on the street, you're like an animal, man. Really, if a guy make a comment like that, or there's other joke I had about the police, blow, blow, blow. In English, blue, 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 constable, Abel. Yeah, there were a lot of exciting, insightful and hurtful names, they were called all sorts of names. And a lot of people, of course, disliked us intensely. I don't know exactly why. I say again, we were there to help you. It's not my fault if you go and make trouble. And what do you expect the police to do? Huh? Tell me. You go and assault your wife, or you get pissed at the bar, and now you start boxing there with people, or you rape a girl which you found somewhere. What the hell do you think the police are going to do to you? Huh? I mean, if you don't do things wrong, the police are not going to be bothered with you. They don't know you. They don't care about you. They have other things to worry about. But anyway, so this orchestra member just got a slap against the face. I think he bled quite a bit, and then he ran away. Yeah, but we were a bit worked up by then, because by this time you've seen everything. You've seen murders, rapes. I remember there was once there was There was a guy who killed his children. He shot them dead. He put a pillow on their head and just poof, shot both dead in the bed, in their beds. And then he murdered his wife. His wife obviously was wondering what was going on, so she was killed in. So she was trying to fight back actually when she was shot dead. And then this mobber gets into the bath and he cuts his throat and his wrist. And so by the time we arrived, just his head is sort of sticking out of the bath, you know, the rest is blood. And the lesson we learned is these little squirtoinkies, you know, these little dogs which lives with you. And it's a good thing because we know if you look at safety net, the other lecture at book I wrote, the criminals are scared of a dog inside the house because they can't get past it. But it's the little dog who will actually eat your body. Starts with the nose, then the ears and the cheeks and finger points. That's what they would eat first. Cats will never do that. Cat will not eat your body. Which is, I always say to people, if you're very old, or like me, I went through quite medical conditions, where at one stage I really didn't think I'm going to make it. Here in Phuket, in the last few months, I'm good now, praise the Lord, but I was alone here, and Rebecca wasn't here, and I was all alone. But at one stage, because one of the cats actually slept with me in the bed, I would put food out in the room as well as water. So that should I die through the night and people can't contact me and they come and look, that the cat would at least survive. The things you do which you learn in the police. Well, it was tough, man. I was in hospital 3 times. I lost 16 kilograms as I sit here today, which is June the 18th, 19th. But anyway, doesn't matter. It's good for me to lose weight and all is good now. Praise the Lord. What I'm trying to make is you saw a lot of things, so you become different. And there was also a shooting incident. At some stage, there were a lot of shooting incidents, but at some stage, the security branch, in some way, the security police cut over money to ANC terrorists inside the country. How I did it, I don't really know, but I knew I did. And so these terrorists then started robbing banks. Now, of course, if I use the word terrorist, it's in the words of the day. Today, the members of parliament, honorable members of parliament. Yeah, but in those days, they were just honorable terrorists. So we would clash with them. And we had a great fear, of course, that you would be called out to a crime scene and ambushed. Because that's what I would have done. Make a false claim. It happened. I speak about it in one of the books. It happened in Northern Ireland. People got called out to the police of a Royal Ulster Constabulary or something got called out. When they went there, they went over a bridge. The bomb exploded, and all of them died. 3 of them died on the scene. So we were expecting this to happen. I mean, we were not stupid. We had a fairly good idea what the terrorists were trying to do and not to do. But there's the disadvantage here. You can't. They have to actually start coming for you. They have to shoot you before you can respond. So they can get you in that first few shots, and they got you. So anyway, there was a bank robbery taking place, and we went there. And as we went there, we picked up the escaping bank robber's vehicle, and they were driving at high speed, and we were driving right behind them. And I was a passenger that day. I quickly found out I'm not as great a driver as I thought I was. In fact, these guys were really, really good, and they were quick. They knew how to drive. I do talk about it a little bit in the first episode as well. And so by some miracle, I think it was at Soshanguve. Now, we chased them all the way from Pretoria into Soshanguve. And as we're behind them, we're coming at about 200 kilos an hour, perhaps 220. There's a gate guard standing at the police station at Soshanguve, and he shoots the driver in the head with his R1 rifle. Wow. It's amazing. I mean, he shot him at about 2-3 yards. And by that time, shots were fired already, so he had all the legal right in the world to do it. I want to say to the liberals who's listening here, you're not going to get anywhere. So obviously, this guy's dead already. In fact, his skull exploded. It went up and it came down again, and he rolled the car. And one of the terrorists inside died all in that car. We found him. He was in I think, in the passenger seat in the front. He was there dead. And there's another one, I think, was injured, and we got arrested right there. And the fourth one, I think, was running. And I'll never forget it. As I speak here, I remember we were in a Golf GTI, and we were going. Now, this is in the middle of a township. There's people around, and it's gravel, so we can't really get a grip. And as we come for him, he would turn around with his AK and he would shoot at us. And then I shouting at my driver was fantastic. I think he's still in the flying squad. He would turn that Golf sideways, and I would shoot through the window out towards this guy, and then he would still go. But at long last, we got him cornered in a house. No shame there. The man of the house, Madola, there at the back, he was making beer or something, and he heard the noise, and when he walked in to see what's going on, this guy shoots him between the legs, where a female cannot be shot. So he shot him there between the legs with his AK, and he fell backwards just as we arrived. We see this guy falling out. And so we went in, and there were other policemen also there. So we sat this house around it. We went in, and this terrorist got shot dead there. Now, it's one of the strangest things in the world to me when you stand there and there's the guy lying dead, and of course we made sure he's dead. Not murder. Don't put words in my mouth. I mean, but you're not going to turn your back on a wounded terrorist. I mean, I don't care if he's wounded. He will either die further properly, or he will be treated, but he will still be searched. I mean, you can't. I mean, we learned that lesson. There was 2 terrorists captured, and then the security policemen put them on the back of their van, of their vehicle, and they drove them out. And for fuck's sakes, they left their AK-47s with them in the van. But they were handcuffed or something, or tied with something. And these guys got loose, and they got their AKs. And what do you think happened? They shot the 2 policemen dead from behind. Yeah, I saw their bodies. Yeah, learned a damn lesson there. Let me tell you again, guys, you grow up when you see your own dead. And I'm not pointing fingers at the 2 security policemen, but they were bloody stupid. They should never have done it like that. They were not following protocol, and they died because of it. So anyway, but it's the funniest feeling when you're there and you see this AK-47 is lying there, and you just put it on safe. It's lying there, and the smoke is coming out of a barrel. And you're thinking, yeah, this is a rifle which could have ended my life. And then in between these years, in 1988, I volunteered to go to the border. So now I had I had to go do the border course, the BOS courses, counterinsurgency course, 6 weeks at Meduskop. So you arrive, and you quickly realize you're not as fit as you think you should be. And you go through the total counterinsurgency training, which is very good. And then if you're a young sergeant and you're unmarried young sergeant like I was, then man, you go to the border for 3 months and you come back, and you go again and you come back. And that's how it went. And we had a lot of great fun and adventure there. But to be honest, it was more counter-terrorism than counterinsurgency. It was a combination of both, which worked out very well for me actually, because later years, when I went into the shadows, I had a fairly good idea about counter-terrorism. Of course, we did a lot of courses in other countries. Read the GMJ books. I'm not going to go into that yet. It's not the time and the place. But we had a lot of adventures, but a lot of things, of course, which you do in the police, you cannot do in the shadows, because whatever you do in the shadows is illegal. It's covert operations. There's nothing legal about it. But anyway, just stories, of course. But for me, the shadows actually started in 1989, because in 1989 I was approached by an officer, very famous officer, very well-known officer, not going to mention his name. I'm not sure if he's alive anymore. He was a major. And he came to me and he said to me, look, Sergeant, can we can we go and have lunch somewhere? And I was like, man, is this guy gay or what? Because, as the sergeant in the police don't mix with a major in the police. We just don't. Officers are there, they have a function, but you know what? You want the job done? Come to the constable, sergeant, warrant officer will do the job. You people sit there, you look pretty, do the parades, man, but leave us alone. That's how it was. And so I said yes. I mean, of course, I knew it was important. You don't look gay to me, to be honest. Remind me when I tell you about the gay story next to a US embassy. And to make a long story short, we went to a hotel, not a hotel actually. We went to a very fancy place, eating place, steakhouse. Those days I still ate steak because before I married foreigners, And he arrived there with what we would call a wimp today. A guy in his 50s, grey hair, bit of a boopens, looks successful, obviously has money, has status, has power, got the university degrees. You can see here's a guy who did something in life. Didn't introduce him, he just said, this is a friend of mine and he's involved. And I just want to say to you, we've been observing you for a long time. Of course, when people start saying that, you start looking around thinking of funniest home movies. Remember those things? Or you're looking for Leon Schuster somewhere, But I'm looking at the guy because I do respect this officer. I do know him well. And he said to me, look, there is a unit in the police which we want to expand. It's the opspoor en uitwis van terrorisme. What is to find terrorists and to wipe them out. So this sounds fantastic to me because at this stage now we've been in the police for 5 years at that stage. You've gone through a mill, you're fairly experienced, and you do know that there's a war going on, a very dirty war indeed, not only on the borders, but also inside the country, which we were, of course, very, very closely related to. And you do know that sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Let's put a scenario for you. Let's say there's a guy who is... who is going to plant a bomb somewhere, right? And that bomb is going to kill a lot of people. Remember the wimpy bombs? Wimpy burgers, what did we call them? Some kind of a word. And so the idea would come up to you to say, but what if we can intercept this guy before he can plant the bomb? Yeah, good idea. But now there's another problem. How do we know about this guy? Because we've got an informant, a police spy right inside at the organization. So if we arrest this guy and we go to court and his attorneys, which is a bunch of sneaky guys, they're definitely going to ask us, how did we know about this, blah, blah, blah. We are on the oath, we have to sort of tell the truth. And so now we have to blow our agent inside that organization, which means we cannot then protect against the next bombing attack. You see where this is heading. It's very dangerous thinking, guys. Very dangerous. But it's logical. It's logical. And then you have to think, well, if you have to cover for your source or your informant or your spy or your impimpy inside the organization, perhaps it's better not to arrest this guy. Perhaps you should just give an order of to say, guys, we don't want arrest. That's all you say. And then what happens is the guys go in and this fellow resisted arrest. He might even have fired a few shots there at you, and you can go and see there's a Tokarev, and it fired a few shots here at you, and now he's dead. I don't say this actually happened. I'm just saying a scenario to you. And that is how you create hit squads. That is where you take a good intention and you make it something so wrong in law, and you cannot defend it. It is wrong. But at the other hand, you need to also have a lot of sympathy for the guys who actually did it, because that was the way they were thinking. But it's wrong in law. But I like the idea. At that stage, I really like the idea of finding a terrorist and wiping out. Because of the reasons I just gave to you. And personal too, by that time you've survived the landmine explosions. You've been at the bomb explosion scenes. You've been you've been around. You've had mates who probably died. You know what's going on. You're not stupid. The story of a rooi gevaar, of a red danger and whatever was actually totally true. Yeah, it was true. It actually did happen. There was an armed assault against the country. Can't deny it today, whatever, but you're lying. So anyway, so we start thinking like that, but I did say to the major, I said, look, I understand that, and I do understand you will then finally promote me to warrant officer because my promotion was held back for an incident with a police general, which we don't speak about now. And then also there's you can work in civilian clothes, you can even have a beard. And it sounded to me like fun, it'd be good. So I went and I spoke to my brother, my ex-brother, who was at that stage an advocate in the security branch, because he was an advocate before he went to do his national service, and then the police drafted him out. And he became an advocate in the police. And he did his 2 years and he left, of course. But he said to me, well, I'm sitting here at security branch headquarters and I'm telling you we're burning files. We're going to release Mandela. Guys, to say that to me in 1989 is treasonous. And it's a shock. This is as good as, I suppose, having sex with a black woman in church. Now, please, it's not a racist thing I'm saying to you. Don't put words in my mouth. I'm just telling you how utterly shocking that was to me. This was like, man, this is not possible. We've been fighting against Mandela and these people since I was born. What the hell? What do you mean they're going to release him? Yes, they've got to release him. I'm telling you, it's over. Hey. So I took a few days off, and I drove down to King Williamstown where my dad is. And I said, Dad, I've been recruited to this place. This is what they tell me. And he got silent. Now, when my dad gets silent, he's pissed off. He's angry. He's serious. And he said to me in the first place, Chris, who decides who die? I said, I don't know, the colonel. He says, the colonel isn't important enough to decide who dies. He's getting orders from somewhere else. And there's only one person in the world who can do that, and that's the state president and the State Security Council. That is where this comes from. And those people will not stand by you when that time comes. Of course, he knew Mandela was being released as well. But he also had troubles because he was the regional magistrate, a very senior one, who was doing all the terrorist trials. So you could think he was also a marked man, and having a Jewish mom, yeah, well, it wasn't that easy for my dad. Let me tell you, he was a brilliant lawyer. Very, very, very good. And he would sit there and he said to me, Chris, this is going to explode. And I've seen many times in my courts, I've seen things which couldn't be explained. He said, but let me tell you something. What was the oath you took? And I'm sure I said this in the first episode of other books as well. And I said, well, I took an oath to sleep on duty and to, and actually that's true. Because the captain who made us take the oath when we enlisted actually said exactly that. And I was the only one who refused to take that oath. Actually, you take an oath to protect the country and blah, 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 the laws and blah, blah, blah. That's the entire thing you say. And then I took it seriously. I mean, guys, look, if you, an honorable man, and I'm sure most of you are, and you've taken an oath, you damn well stand by your oath, especially if God's involved here. Your yes is your yes, and your no is your no, and that's it. So anyway, for me, this was serious. So I refused, and I took the right oath in to become a policeman, and I always remember that oath. And I said, no, I took an oath to, follow the law and blah. And he says, well, keep to your damn oath. You go and arrest them, you bring them to the courts, and we will decide, and be damn grateful that you're not in a position where you have to decide these things. Of course, later years, when I became an attorney, I understand exactly what he said. So I said, no, I again had a meeting with a woman at the major, and I said to her, I'm sorry, I've heard that Mandela is being released. And they're like, wow, how do you know that? And I said, well, I know. And they said, well, we think we know how you know, but it doesn't matter. But the funny thing happened in the police in that year, in 89. There was suddenly a whole bunch of things being, we had to go for psychological tests again. Because before you enlisted, you had to go for a psychological test. You also had to have matric in my day, but there were a lot of them who didn't. They were not bad people. They were just different. And so I filled in the forms quite correctly. I wasn't playing the fool with the forms. I filled it in quite well. And I think that's where they picked up my profile, because to work in covert operations, you really need a special type of personality. It's not for everybody. Now, when I say work in covert operations, I don't mean like an informant or a source or whatever. I mean as actually somebody who's working there. I wouldn't want to use the name agent, because that's not quite right. I use the word intelligence officer, but yeah, more in that line than anything else. You need a very, very different type of person, and then it also depends on where you work. The guy who's going to work inside the country is not the same as the guy who works outside the country. Very, very different personalities. But read the GMJ books and you'll wake up to that too. You will learn. Especially in Codename Crocodile, I went into quite into how the recruitment takes place and how it used to be, and how the different units, which are still denied to this very day, came into being as far as I know, blah, blah, blah. But that's another story. So I said, no, I don't want to do it. And so this woman looks at me and he says, look, we like you and we respect your decision, but I'm telling you what, Chris, this is not the end of the road. At some stage in the future, someone else, not me, someone else will contact you again. And I said, but sir, how will I know it's from you? And he says, I'm going to give you a code. I'm going to write the code down for you here. I want you to memorize it. So he takes a tissue, like a serviette, and he writes something on it, and he shows it to me, and he says, memorize. Now, I can memorize, man. I can memorize things. You will not get legal degrees if you can't memorize. And so I memorized it, and I said, okay, so I know, I've got it. He says, well, then, Chris, eat the serviette. Eat it. I thought, we back with Leon Schuster here, man. But anyway, look at the major woman. He's like, get them. So I ate the serviette. And I took a large swallow of beer, I can tell you. Black Label, man. Black Label. Or was it Amstel? Amstel, perhaps. So anyway, 10 years went past. I left the police in 91. I first had a turn at the police dog school as a dog master. Went through the training there. It's in the book. I also speak about going to a border. I speak about going on riot duty. All of those things, everything is in this book, book 2, of the Mean Streets. And then this is not in the books, but I'll just tell you about it. Why not? So about 10 years later, 9 years later, almost 10 years later, now I'm an attorney. I'm at a very well-known law firm, human rights law firm, would you believe? I've gone through 6 years at university. I've done the Juris, I've done LLB. I've started with LLM, master's degree in law. I then did the law school. I did my articles. I passed my bar exams, my side bar exams. I'm an attorney now. I'm standing to get married. Met a girl, was a good woman. We produced one child, who's now in his 20s. I don't have contact with him anymore, but that's one of the sad things in life. But the marriage in the beginning was actually good. But it ended after 5 years. It doesn't matter. It's one of those things. And so I'm just about to get married. It's 1998. I'm in this prestige law firm. I'm sitting in the middle of Johannesburg at Commissioner Street on the 27th floor. And everything is in English. And even though Kopsies at that stage Free State University, where I graduated, was the best law faculty in the country, no doubts. In those days, don't know about today. And we could see it. We were better than the Bits guys or Potchefstroom or wherever. We were better. We knew more. But we did our training in Afrikaans, man. And everything is in English. And English in law is different than English in the normal sense of the word. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, "Course, I'm going to die in this place. This is horrible, but I'm struggling to understand what the client is even saying to me." But luckily, I'm now 50 years old. I'm a bit older than the rest, and because I'm bald since I was 22 years old, people think I know more than what I actually do. But anyway, I'm here. This is a famous law firm. It's representing Nelson Mandela and the rest of them, and I'm here from the side. But they treated me very well. I have to say that. It was a Muslim law firm, still exists, affiliated in 100 and something countries. Fantastic people. I will never say something bad about them, ever. The place where I did my articles, I got nothing good to say about them whatsoever in Bloemfontein. But you know what, whatever. So I'm sitting there, and the next moment now I've got myself a cell phone. Yeah. Because I needed a cell phone. So I've got this Motorola or something, and it's got this little screen of a little aerial. Looks like a brick, man. Or was it a Nokia? It might have been a Nokia. I can't remember. But anyway, so I got there, and the next moment I got a text message coming in. And the text message is from an unknown number, or block number, whatever. And on it is just that code. Yeah, that code that the WIM gave me 9 years before. Yeah. Now I'm looking at this, and it's the first time in 9 years that I actually see this code. And I look around and I think, Leon Schuster, you moer, where are you? Because this doesn't happen to normal people, man. I've got a beard by now. I'm a bit overweight. I'm not a fit young policeman anymore. I haven't touched a firearm in 5 years. I'm like out of it, you know. So I'm like sitting around, and I look, and everything looks so normal, you know. There's a few people standing, smoking and talking. You have a typist are just typing away. There's the phone ringing with a colleague. I'm just sitting there and I'm looking, and I think, wow. And the next moment my phone rings, which is not a cell phone, it's a desk phone. Desk phone rings, pick up. This has to come through the reception, you know, through the skalkelbord. Female on the other side speaking to me in English with a little bit of a French accent. And she says, "Did you get my message?" Not, "Hello, how are you? Hoe gaan het?" You know, nothing. Just, "Did you get my message?" I said, "Yes, I got your message." She says, "I think we should talk. We should meet. I'm waiting for you downstairs." I say, "But, madam, I'm an attorney. I can't just leave here. I've got clients coming." She says, "No, your clients have cancelled. I'm waiting downstairs." I said, "Yeah, okay. I said, "But I don't know what you look like." She says, "Goose, I know what you look like." Says my name in such a strange way. "I know what you look like. I'm waiting." Pick, and phoned up. Fuck. Now I think to myself, right, Koos, have you ever seen The Matrix? Well, I'm not sure The Matrix was even out then, but this is like the red pill and the blue pill, man. What were you going to do? If you stand up, she's going to disappear forever, or she might attack you. But if you go down, it's going to change your life forever. What do you do? What do you do? Now you tell me, guys, what would you do? What would you do? I don't think there's one of you will tell me no, we'll just forget about it. No, you won't. Not if you have my personality, like hell you will. And so the next moment, my phone rings again. It's a reception. "Oh, Mr. Kotze, we just want to say to you, a client called. He's so sorry. Can they move us to tomorrow? Something came up. They apologized most humbly. You can charge them for the time wasted. Blah, blah, blah." Okay. Obviously, this woman has influence because we're not talking about a normal guy here. We're talking somebody close to cabinet level. Yeah, and they just cancelled. So I said, yeah. I said, okay, well, that happens. I tell you what, madam, talking to the reception now. I think I'll just go out quickly and get something to eat. If you don't mind, I'll take my cell phone back. She says, of course, sir, no problem. You do that. If you go past McDonald's, just bring me something back. And I said, yeah, no, I'll bring you. No, I'll bring you a Big Mac, whatever. So I got my jacket on and I got into the lift, and it's a long way down. And I went down and I thought, Chris, what are you going to do? I said, well, just keep walking, Chris. That's what you do, man. You just keep walking. If this woman will intercept you somehow, she knows what you look like. So now I'm walking down the street, and the next moment, here she is. There she stands. In the books in GMJ, she became known as Angelique. It's not her real name. I don't know what's her real name, to be honest, but we called her something else. And she stood there, athletic, beautiful woman, totally in shape. She's like brown hair, green eyes, standing there, looking at me, a slight smile on her face. And I look behind her because, now the police things are coming back. And I see, yeah, there to the left, there's a groot eiers. There's quite a big guy standing there. He's just staring around, but he's observing. Look to his left, yeah, there's another one standing. I look a little bit to this side, yeah, there's another one. Yeah, they're all there. They're just smiling, and I look behind this guy. There's a girl. There's a woman standing there, and she's smiling at me. Yeah, it's funny. Some of them are black, some of them are colored. One is Indian, one is white. They're just standing there in Commissioner Street in Johannesburg. And I look at her, and she looks at me, and she says to me, I have command. And she puts her hand out to shake hands. Firm handshake. I look at her, and she looks at me, says, I have command. I say, Madame, command what? Well, who? I'm not in the police anymore. I'm not even in the police reserves anymore. We were disbanded. Because once you leave the police, of course, you go to the police reserve. So technically, since they never actually officially did it, we probably technically are still in the police reserve. We probably now been promoted, through the years. I don't know. Whatever. It's a joke. And he says, I've got command of people like you. Now, of course, you have a choice. I'm sure you figured it out. You can come with me. We can go and have lunch. We can talk a bit. You will never regret meeting me unless you do something to me, in which case you will die. And she says with a smile, and I flip and believed her. I still believe it to this very day. You can see danger, right? When you've been in the police for a few years, and even if you're a man, guys, if you know this, If you walk down the street and you see a Eier standing there, you can take him or you can't. Not to say you won't fight. I mean, you will still fight. You will still do what you need to do. But in your heart where you can take it, where you can't. I was looking at this woman. I thought myself, what you have here is dangerous. This thing is dangerous. She's totally confident. She's got it. She's got to act screwed on, and I really like that. I really like that about her. And she said, "Oh, you can walk away. I'm giving you a fair chance. You can walk away. But once you walk with me, you're going to keep on walking with me. And it's going to be a long road. And there is no way out for you." And then she quoted Kim Philby. Now, Kim Philby was part of a Cambridge 4, some say 5. They were spies. Kim Philby was the leader. He was actually the head of MI6 counter Soviet Union desk or something like that, a Russia desk. But he was actually a KGB agent. Yeah. And he had other friends who were thinking. We think of Donald McLean, who died just a few years ago, Burgess, Anthony Blunt. I knew all these people because remember, guys, I read since I was 4 years old, and the Great Game always interested me very, very much. But I was never impressed with the National Intelligence Service. I still am not. nothing about them ever impressed me. And it's in the book as well, where I describe certain incidents which we found on the South African border, where we knew we got hold of a terrorist and they would arrive and say, no, it's not. Now, perhaps they were covering for the guy, it's possible, but in our minds, they were not that good. And if you listen to legacy conversations, we talked to a Brigadier Henny Heymans of Longwy fame, who was at the State Security Council. And he will tell you that most of the information came from the police security branch and not national intelligence. But whatever, it's for them to explain themselves. I was not impressed with them. This woman was obviously not part of it. And she quoted Kim Philby to me as we walking towards the shop, the coffee shop, and the other hooligans is here all around me at the back. Out of hearing distance, but they were, I know they were. And one is walking up ahead. I mean, this is slick, man. It's slick. And we're walking, and she says to me, it takes 1 ruble to get into my organization, but it takes 2 rubles to get out. Always remember that. Of course, in later years, I did walk out. I walked out of operations. And about 9 years later, was it 9 years? Let me think. Yeah, it was about 9 or 10 years later, I walked out. Anyway, so that was how it started for me in the Great Game. I don't think I've revealed this ever before. In the latest book, Codename Snake 606, I do describe similar thing like that. One of the characters was recruited. Very much the same type of scenario, but this is the actual way it happened. And that's the story. That's the story of me in the police. So directly from the police came the attorney phase, which I wrote books about as well. The memoirs of a rogue attorney. It's not available anymore. I don't think it's important. But I started the forensic law revolution in South Africa. It was me. I started it. But anyway, it's all these things. The point I'm trying to make to you is everything goes back to your service years. That's where you were formed. That's where you got certain ideas and certain ways of doing things. So don't take your service lightly. That's my point. Your service isn't lightly. You were honorable, man. You did well. You tried your best. And of course, you got your medals. I've got medals too. In fact, I was issued Combating Terrorism medal, which is the same as your Pro Patria in the army. I was issued that 3 times. When you go to the border, many times you get issued it. 75th year medal as well. And I've never worn them in public ever in my life. And I look back on my service years with great fondness these days. But I will say that to you. The police years did change me. I do write about it in the book where we once were watching Mickey Mouse, really Mickey Mouse, like the comic. And my friends were sitting there and watching on a video machine, and I looked at them and I saw they were dead. Their eyes were dead. They were laughing, but their eyes weren't laughing. And these were honorable chaps, 22 years old, 23 years old. They knew nothing but the police work. And they died. Emotionally, they died. And the next day I was shaving to go to work. And I was looking at myself and I stand in the mirror and I said, Chris, you're dead. You died. You're 23 years old and you feel 55. It's a bit of a joke with me and Rebecca now that I turned 57, 58 now. She said to me the other day, yeah, of course you were born now, because you were born old. How does it feel to be 1 year old or 2 years old? Yeah, that's what the police did to me. I became old before my time. I stopped believing in people. I still don't believe in people. I think all people are bad. It's only by the grace of God that you will make the right decisions. Most will not. And whatever horribleness people can do to animals, to themselves, to their loved ones, to strangers, will never surprise me. Never. The cruelty of man is beyond belief. Beyond belief. You listening to me probably never saw a raped child. You never saw the blood. You know, never saw the smelled the crime, smelled the, you smell it. You smell crime. You smell death. So in my 6 year in the police, by 91, end of 91, I decided I will buy myself out. I will leave the force, because by this time they were bringing in unions and all sorts of shite which does not belong in the police force, and I knew that it was over for us. There's no way we would be promoted. Most of us would not be. Most of them would be promoted to warrant officer or perhaps captain. Worse than that, they started taking away our camouflage uniform. They started taking away our assault weapons. We became a total civilian police. Of course, it wouldn't work in Africa. It didn't work in Africa, you idiots. You took something which was perfect and was working perfectly, and you effed it up until what you have today. Congratulations, you idiots. That's what you did. And we also knew, of course, we would be disbanded, in the sense that all the elite units, all murder and robbery, the special branch, whatever specialist units would be disbanded. And they were. And what was the result, idiot? Yeah, look at the crime levels. Look at the crime levels. Yeah. You know, in many ways, I'm grateful that the SAP force, the African police force, don't exist anymore. Because like the Rhodesians, like 3-2 Battalion, like 3-1 Battalion and the rest of you, 6-1, we can look back and say, you new people, you're not part of us. Nah, you would not have made it with us. Nah, not you. We can say that without arrogance, just statements of fact. Having said that, I don't think the SAPS is that bad, because if they were that bad, the jails couldn't be that full. So there must be some good about it. But it's a total different mindset. We were in the police to fight crime, terrorism, and we did it better than anyone else in the world. Our detectives at one stage had more than a 90% solving rate, which means they got their man. And of course, we were feared and we were respected. Respect is very important to me. That's why I ban people so quickly. Because if you come and you start writing shite about me or about a client, my first idea is, well, would you have said that to me in my face? Probably not, because you ain't as brave as you think you are. And then I'm not in the mood for you. You don't have respect. You don't respect the service of a man who's telling you story here or legacy. I get rid of you. I don't want you close to me. And I don't want people who complain and nag all the time either. I've seen that in the police as well. Get rid of such people. You people know what I'm talking about. But then you walk into a civilian life and you are very ill trained to be in civilian life. Because where you come from, a handshake is a man's word and honor. And the salute means something. And the oath means something. And you go into the damn civilian world in Civvy Street, and none of these things matter to these people. You know what matters to them? Themselves, money, sex, alcohol, drugs. That's all they care about. All they care about. All the things which disgusted me as a policeman. Now, there's nothing wrong with sex in a marriage, of course not, or people who consult, consenting adults, nothing wrong, which reminds me, here at the end, let me tell you quickly the story of the US Embassy and the gays. Now, of course, in those days, gays were illegal, which is wrong. If you want to have a gay relationship somewhere in the privacy of your own house, and you want to have a consulting partner, consenting, then please do so. I have no problem with that. You know, don't care. But in those days, it was illegal, and the gays were actually hunted down. It's sad to say. But in this case, I was driving with my Golf GTI. I think I was driving down very close to where the US Embassy is today. There, I think, what is it, Hatfield, around about there. And there's huge parks there. I don't know if the parks are still there, but they used to be there. They were in fact building the US Embassy at that stage. I've been to the US Embassy inside quite a few times after with Angelique. It is described in one of the books, I think, Codename Honeybee. Codename Honeybee, yeah. I've actually got a copy of Codename Honeybee here in one of the books standing here. But anyway, it is. Codename Honeybee described where we actually went into the embassy. But I've been there many times. Let me tell you, they ain't as good or tough as they think they are. The US Marines, they are totally compromised. But anyway, to make a long story short, I'm driving down the road. I see here's a guy walking. And he looks like he's goed gemoor. In other words, he looks like he's being assaulted. So stop. Hey, what's wrong with you? No, Sergeant Weir. No. I say, look, man, you need to tell me what happened. He said, Sergeant, this is dreadful. This is too bad. So after a while, he started talking because I was like, look, can I take you to the hospital then at least? But if there's a crime being committed, I need to know. And so it turns out he's a student there at the local university, and he and his mates decided they're going to do some gay bashing. It was their Saturday night vermaak, with what they do on Saturday nights. So they would get the guy who they think looks the most butch or the most gay, and they would use him, and then he would then pick up a genuine gay person, and they would walk to a tree, and then under the tree they would sort of make out or whatever they do, man. I don't know. And so the rest of them would be sitting in the tree like a bunch of owls. And then the idea would be when they arrive below the tree, and this guy start making his moves, and these guys would descend from above, and they never kick the shit out of a gay guy. Yeah, so that's the idea. And the idea worked very well until that night when the guy he picked up turned out to be some sort of a karate champion. So this guy started really abusing me, kicked the hell out of him, he kicked and moved him, and then he ran away. So he was one of the survivors. And we told him to stop this nonsense because just a few weeks later, one of the guys actually drew a firearm and shots were fired. And then about a year later after that, they picked up a guy again and they walked again to a tree. And I don't know, started making out or something. And the next moment, nothing happened because they were under the wrong tree. Yeah. Apparently that didn't turn out well either. Right, that is Mean Streets 2. I've been speaking a long time. I wasn't meaning to actually speak about the book. There is a third book, Mean Streets 3, which I'll speak about later. That's the one which is about the jokes, funny incidents. But there are funny incidents in all the books. This one too. I just touched on the more serious aspects here. It's available in South Africa, yeah, in hardcover. Soft cover actually, but in paper anyway. It's also available on Amazon in audio as well as soft cover, hardcover as well as Kindle. If you want to get hold of a book, please get hold of it and read it. There are people who say that's the closest you could ever come to the mean streets of South Africa in those years. Not my words. It's a book which I will probably be remembered for in my own name. To me, it's not important anymore. I moved on. But yeah, thanks for listening. God bless.